Thank you to everyone for joining today. My name is Matt McGurk, and I'm coming to you from Source Defense. The topic of today's conversation is a practical 90-day way to get these new compliance gaps in PCI DSS filled and off of your plate. We will be taking questions throughout the session, well, probably throughout the end of the session. However, if you do have any thoughts, feel free to throw them into the chat, and I will handle those once we get to that section. Anything at all is appreciated. My name is Matt McGurk. I'm a solution architect here at Source Defense. I've been with the company for almost 6 years now. About 6 years. Since we went to market, basically. So I've helped our first customers all the way through to today. And I've talked to hundreds of different organizations, maybe thousands of people at this point, about the topic we're going to discuss today. I have 15 years of web application experience as well, and security in that area too. So if we have technical folks on the phone and they have thoughts in their own areas of expertise, I'm happy to go into technical depth. Of course, we can leave that on the table. The goal of today's session is to talk more practically about how to get this stuff done than every last little bit of mechanical minutia. Source Defense, like I said, we have been working against this problem for 5-6 years now. We've been engineering technology to solve problems related to client-side security, web application, client-side security for about 8 years. We protect over 45 billion in e-commerce sales for our current customers, and we actively prevent and thwart about 8 billion different privacy and security violations with our tools and technologies. Long way of saying that we have expertise in this area that's been proven out by real-world tests and such. What I'd like to talk about today is understanding eSkimming attacks. eSkimming is the language used in the Data Security Standard version 4 to reference anything related to web pages and the code within them. Another term for this would be client-side security, like I said a few moments ago, being distinct from server-side security, which has been a well-trod part of the world in application security for a very long time. Securing the code inside of our web pages and the supply chain therein is a newish, getting less new every day, but still pretty new part of the overall universe of security practices. The core of the issue here is a technology called JavaScript. JavaScript is what makes everything on a web page interactive, from filling out a form to an animation to et cetera. It's all JavaScript. Because of how JavaScript was engineered about 30 years ago, I think we're coming up on the 30th anniversary this fall, if anyone wants to celebrate. JavaScript was engineered without any idea of security control or concept of permissions or et cetera. So no matter what the code is or where it came from or what it's supposed to do, it can do anything to the web page and therefore the visitor's data therein, including card numbers. You may have heard a number of different words and names and terms and et cetera for the kind of attacks perpetrated via JavaScript. MageCart is kind of the security brand name, so to speak. Comes from some of the very first attacks that ever occurred against the Magento e-commerce shopping platform and their shopping cart in specific, hence the term MageCart. eSkimming is what you see in PCI DSS, as I mentioned, because there is a lot of parallel to skimming credit card numbers physically, right? Like if somebody installs a skimmer in front of a gas station pump payment terminal, this is kind of the same idea, except it happens on a web page. Form jacking, credential harvesting, click jacking, user experience hijacking, a bunch of other stuff too. Because like I said, this area has still been kind of solidifying in a lot of different ways. So there's been lots of different terms, but as a general guide, web application client-side security is the best, in my opinion, way to describe the issue. We talk about a third-party supply chain in this sense because a lot of the code that is loaded into web pages, including payment pages, is not actually native to the website that you're looking at. Third-party integrations are things like marketing tools, customer support widgets, application telemetry stuff. So basically capabilities that one would want in the front end of their web pages, of their web applications, and that you're not going to develop in-house. So, it's vendor code, but it gets integrated into the web pages on the fly as people are navigating through. So it makes it a little bit different from like a traditional I don't know, firmware attack, or even something like SolarWinds or something like Log4j. It's a little different kind of supply chain thing than that, but it is the same idea. We do, by the way, we've done some original research on this. It's possible to get a copy of that from our website, and maybe we can throw that in the chat in a little bit. But to sum up to say, this happens on basically every website, including payment pages, and it's everybody's website has this problem, more or less. That leads into the compliance issue. This problem, like I said, the security issue has existed forever. The practical solutions to it have existed for a long time now. And finally, compliance is catching up to that. That's why part of DSS4 includes these new requirements, because there are actual substantive impacts to the overall health of online commerce and e-commerce. And so therefore, we need some general standards around it. Attacks and notifications thereof have been coming from basically every single regulatory body. So obviously now the Security Council, but Visa and the other payment brands individually have submitted information about this, or alerts about this. The FBI, a bunch of other folks, and they target the supply chain aspect of this, the code that the merchant does not necessarily control themselves. 443, I could throw any number of statistics at you about this, but Europol, like I said, the FBI, Australian authorities, there was a really gross case a little while ago when the Australian wildfires were unfortunately occurring, where there were fake donation sites set up using this particular technique. So suffice it to say, there are real world precedents for this, and it is a substantive risk to merchants online and their customers, their visitors. The specific requirements in DSS4 are requirements number 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. If we delve specifically into them, I usually summarize this as there are four things. There's four verbs that someone needs to do to be in compliance with these particular requirements. For payment page scripts, you need to have, and I'm going to read these out of order. I apologize. It's just how I think of it. You need to have an inventory of all of your payment page scripts. You must have a written justification and authorization for each of those payment page scripts. You need to have a mechanism to verify the integrity of each script. And also in 11.6.1, which I consider to be kind of like the tamper-proofing requirements for the stuff you would do to satisfy SORP 6.4.3. But 11.6.1 says you need to monitor the the contents of the payment page as well as the scripts, and you need to monitor what are called HTTP response headers, which is the metadata that the server sends back with a web page. It's like the extra info that tells the browser how to interpret content. So we need to monitor those as well, because they can contain security features, and if those features change, it could indicate a degradation in security because of a misconfiguration, or possibly even an indicator of compromise. When we talk about this over the years, and I know 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 are relatively new, but the misconceptions that we've heard along the way, as it is a new area, are myriad. One of them would be a full redirect to a checkout. So basically, this has a lot to do with the architecture of a given merchant's website. Like if you're using a payment service provider to de-scope or limit the scope of some parts of the web application, whether that's through a redirect or another mechanism like an iframe, that is no longer, unfortunately, a complete separation of liability. Under 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, there's language in the SAQA and D and other areas that say that basically if you have a page let's see, a page that contains the URL of a payment page, so like the contents of an iframe or et cetera, that parent page would also be in scope. And so the responsibility has gotten more blended and has gotten more intricate in some ways and larger scope. And then the second thing, these are all following on similar themes, but the second thing I would point out here is that first-party JavaScript. So that is the code that a merchant would develop themselves or use internally. Those are in scope as well. First-party scripts are in scope as well for both 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. Excuse me, both at least 6.4.3. If you look at the guidance there, it's both the origin from somewhere else as well as from the merchant's own infrastructure. We recently, Source Defense, recently did some work with CoalFire. We published a white paper with them, and they have their own thoughts on this that we developed with them. And I think the most interesting thing, I would recommend everyone reads the entire white paper. I think it's useful and valuable. And we have provided in the chat there a link to it where you can grab a copy of it. But I would hope that the QSAs in the audience would agree. The definition of payment page is a little muddy in DSS, and that's not anybody's fault. It's a big, complicated document, but the payment page, when you look at it and you compare all the different definitions across the different documents, does get a little weird and a little imprecise. And so CoalFire and Source Defense's thought on the matter is that you need to look at from a practical security standpoint, like you actually want to protect your visitors, you need to look at the entire commerce flow. The idea being that any individual an attacker who can get into any part of the website that looks like part of the commercial transaction. I'm going through a checkout process on a product detail page or something. If an attacker can successfully modify that page and say, pop up a thing that says, hey, put in your credit card number and you will receive 25% off your order, even though that page, the product detail page I'm describing, was not a payment page, it still represents a very rich target for the attacker, as does the parent page of the iframe. So even though the actual payment fields are separated out, that parent page is a very ripe vector. So as we think about this from a practical security standpoint, the term payment flow becomes useful, workflow, happy flow, whatever you call it in your context. But the idea that the holistic user experience is worth protecting. The second thing that we pull out of that CoalFire paper are some important clarifications or distinctions, which is that I think the most important things here are that there is guidance in PCI DSS 4, and specifically, it's in 643, around different technologies one could use for this, CSP and SRI being the examples. And what on the left here you can see is that the specific problems with CSP and SRI, and I'll get into this a little bit more further in the talk, is that with the third and fourth party, with the vendor code integration examples of payment page scripts, it's really, really tricky to understand what those are and implement CSP to handle them. When you talk about, again, language gets a little muddy. When you talk about integrity monitoring, which is in these requirements we're discussing and also shows up in other parts of DSS, of course, it gets a little tricky because the nature of comparing different files in a browser on the fly is very, very different from comparing the version of files that are on, in a database that you own or et cetera. And then last but not least, embedding tamper-resistant tamper detection script in the payment page, that is guidance as well. And it's in my opinion, well, I know it's literally in there. We're talking about putting an active control, a script inside of the payment page rather than using something like CSP and SRI, which is in many ways passive, right? It's about defining things beforehand and then relying on them to work in the future. And so a couple of cool, or I think interesting insights pulled out of that CoalFire white paper. I would recommend that everyone reads it in detail, as experts other than me generated a lot of thought. And so I hope I'm doing a good enough job of representing it. Go right to the source. Don't rely on my summation. To meet and maintain these requirements, now that we've hashed them out and discussed them just a little bit, there's a couple ways I see to do this. Like I said, in the guidance, CSP and SRI are mentioned. And when I look at that from a practical sense, and when I've seen people approach this problem over the years, I would call this kind of like a multi-solution approach or a homegrown, homebrewed, do-it-yourself sort of thing, which is not to denigrate the different practices that have to come together for this kind of thing. You're going to need AppSec to coordinate with compliance and probably with a marketing or e-commerce department or digital media department. So there's a lot of expertise that comes into this, but it ends up being something that's implemented in-house, so to speak. And the thing about these, so this would, in my opinion, include content security policy and sub-resource integrity. So let me describe those in just a little bit more detail for anybody who might not be familiar. CSP and SRI, first of all, they're usually implemented together. CSP stands for Content Security Policy, and it is effectively a whitelisting and blacklisting approach. There's a little bit more nuance to it, but honestly, not very much. What you're going to do for a content security policy is look at your payment pages or your whole site, figure out where scripts are coming from, figure out which ones are supposed to be there, and then write a list of those, basically what's called, a CSP directive file that ends up in the on the web server and then gets pushed to the web browser, and the web browser works with it to make sure unauthorized code isn't loaded. The cousin to this is sub-resource integrity. Sub-resource integrity is a way to make sure that the browser does not load a file that has changed from a known good version of the file. It's a hashing approach or a fingerprinting technique, basically, where you as a merchant would go through those files I mentioned before. You would look at each of the files. You would work with those outside vendors as well to verify that those were known good copies of the files, or you would do your own code review on them. And then you'd hash the file. You'd say, okay, this is the known good one. You provide that again to the server sends it to the browser, and the browser can verify that the file is what's expected. Excuse me. So the trouble with this is, I think, hopefully relatively straightforward or obvious, despite that explanation. You need to really closely coordinate with every single part of the website to make that work. If third-party scripts change all the time, I mean, literally the contents of the files change all the time. And when those changes happen, the hash is no longer valid, then the web page will break. Likewise, every time the whitelist is inaccurate, something's going to break. And then beyond all of that, someone needs to do the work of inventorying, writing those directives, hashing the stuff, working with the vendor. Just what I'm trying to get at here is that CSP and SRI are not bad technologies. I think they're well-intentioned technologies. And in cases where you own like an intranet application or something, like a timesheet application that's used internally, and you own the code and you own the infrastructure and you own the release cycle and the CI/CD and everything else, then CSP and SRI might be a good approach. For cases where you are relying on outside code loaded on the fly, it just falls apart. It's not a realistic business solution to the problem, so to speak. It's not enough time, money, and effort in the world to make that work. To summarize the thing and like how a tool-based approach, which is what I call ours. I mean, obviously we're here talking about source defense, but generally speaking, I would call an alternative to CSP and SRI a tool-based or vendor-based approach. The comparison between us and CSP is that, well, I mean, I hope it's in black and white here, is that you're doing the thing on the left if you want to go with CSP and you're owning all of that, and somebody at your org has to generate all of that. Whereas source defense is 2 lines of code, or 2 lines broken into something readable for our talk today. And we do that for you. So that's just a black and white comparison between the two different things, and I hope that illustrates the point. Let me talk just real quick. I want to show you guys an attack because I think it's kind of cool, or a simulation of one, therefore. So basically, we've talked a lot about what this stuff is and in the abstract, but I want to talk in more practical terms in case you're curious. So I have a web browser here. I'm looking at the New York Times for no particular reason. And by the way, I just want to reiterate, this is a simulation. Nobody needs to call the FBI or anything. I'm just manipulating my web browser and showing you what would happen if the Times were to suffer from a client-side attack. So real quick, I just opened up the developer tools in my browser, and this will be the most technical part of the presentation, so don't stress too much. But all I want to illustrate here is that there are a lot of pieces of code, a lot of JavaScript that loads into my web browser as I navigate through the New York Times website. Lots of different stuff serving lots of different purposes, and also from lots of different places on the internet. So if you have eagle eyes, you might be able to see that the New York Times is the source of a lot of this stuff. And a lot of the rest of it is not from the New York Times. And the reason I point that out is if you think about the problem space that we're talking about, all of this stuff is beyond the control of the New York Times application security team. Like they can't go tell GeoEdge or TikTok or anything else what to do with their code and how to secure their servers. And that's where the supply chain thing comes in. So I just wanted to illustrate that in a substantive way. Secondly, if you're talking about CSP and SRI and inventorying and justifications and whatnot, this is the raw material of that process. Somebody going through and looking at this stuff, and this is the work. You're looking at it right here. So what does this look like if there's an attack? Well, let me go back here and start to log into my Times account. If you take a look on the left-hand side of my screen, this is the New York Times check-in and login workflow. The same principles would apply to a checkout flow or anything else. I'm going to turn off NordPass real quick so that we don't have to look at it. So here on the New York Times logins page, you can see we have the usual user experience. On the right-hand side, we have this black and green box. So what is this? This is part of my demonstration attack, which shows us what's happening. In reality, there is no black and green box, no scary terminal thing, but I want us to be able to see what's actually going on as part of the demonstration. So as you can see, as I start to type into the form here, this attack, because it's JavaScript and it's snuck into the web page through that supply chain, can see any of the data, can change what the page does, how it behaves, and et cetera. It has unfettered access to the page. When I click continue here, we're going to see that like I said, not only can it collect data, it can also change what the page does. So here the attacker has injected their own form to collect different information than the visitor might actually normally volunteer at this point. So the idea is that they don't need to wait for me to renew my subscription or to buy a tote bag or whatever. The attacker can simply ask for what they want. When you hear the term form jacking, this is that. This is also why the iframe stuff changed, right? Because imagine that login prompt from before was embedded in an iframe. If the attacker could change the page around the iframe or anywhere else in the payment flow, then they can introduce their own stuff and steal data and et cetera. That's why the separation of concerns is no longer so very clean between a merchant and a payment service provider. When I finish up this process here in my demo, we get redirected to an error page and off to customer service. That's just because I don't want to interact with the Times web app in any real substantive way. I don't want to log in. But in reality, consider that the attacker could simply pass the visitor on to their account. Like they could just continue the process. There'd be no obvious evidence to the visitor that anything weird had happened. Like that's where the skimming thing comes from. It's just invisible to the visitor and their data gets skimmed off of the page and sent somewhere else on the internet. And then consider secondarily that from the perspective of the New York Times, nothing really happened either. Like there's no tripwire or log of any of that stuff. It's just something happening out here in computer land and in internet land in Matt McGurk's web browser in Connecticut. So there's no evidence of this anywhere. That's why these attacks are so persistent and they're so successful. So just a quick detour there, but sometimes it's useful to see the practical aspects of this and not just the black and white of the requirements themselves. So real quick, I want to talk about source defense and what we do, or what one should expect from a tool-based approach, a vendor-based approach, in my opinion. Source defense has what we call a client-side security platform. Like I said, we've been developing technology for about 8 years, almost a decade, to solve these kind of problems. And we have basically two different layered approaches. Detection, so we can provide tools entirely externally to secure a website and meet these requirements. And which will get you very, very far and help you meet the requirements with basically no deployment whatsoever, and no work, therefore, from your dev teams or anybody else. The second option, and this is an addition, we also do all this stuff and when we're protecting, but basically we can control what code does as it executes inside of web pages and provide security control. So you've heard me say a few times, the browser has no native security controls or permissions around JavaScript. So source defense puts those in. Basically, we solve that problem. We fill that gap. And in filling that gap, we also fill the gaps in 643 and 1161 that people are trying to solve for right now. And the key thing about protection is that it, in a lot of ways, automates the remediation of this problem. And I'll talk about how it works, but rather than rely on someone to receive an alert and then do an investigation and then take action and then remediate, the source defense approach is about putting rules in place up front and then preventing malicious behavior if and when it happens, stopping it at the time it occurs. So that's our approach to it. And if you think back to the requirements, that is the heart of that part in 1161 of a tamper proofing mechanism script. In fact, that's embedded within the page. We are that, if you were curious how we map onto the requirements. We've also built interfaces to make it super duper easy for individuals who are working on this problem. So if you work at a merchant and you're responsible for the compliance and making sure that your boxes are checked for your SAQ or your ROC, We have tools to do exactly that and then let you get on with your day without needing to become a subject matter expert in client-side security. What that looks like in practice is I'm trying to see if I should do the slides or if I want to talk about it live. Let's go ahead and let's go back here. Yeah, let's take a look at a web browser. Why not? So let me pull up a Source Defense dashboard here. So what we have developed is what we call a PCI security dashboard. So this interface that you're seeing here is a purpose-built, task-specific dashboard for folks to help meet the client-side security requirements in PCI DSS 4. And we just literally call out exactly how we do that with these modules at the bottom. So like I said a few times, we got a whole bunch of tech and a whole bunch of tools. Think of this dashboard as a lens that narrows down all of our expertise and all of our capability into 6 boxes that you can look at once a week or less, and then move on with the rest of your life. So script inventorying, that first of the 4 verbs that I mentioned, providing a justification workflow for each individual script on your website. So automatically detecting what's there, and then providing a way for someone who is tasked with figuring out what those scripts are and why they're there with an easy workflow to get that done. Monitoring web headers, which is a very dry and technical subject, but I'll suffice it to say we do that and make it really easy. In fact, we're just going to alert you when something changes. So it's about baselining, setting a known good set of those headers, which is a task that takes about 5 minutes, and then only being alerted when they change. And then last but not least, integrity monitoring. So like I said before, we talked about, in my opinion, it is not the strongest place to be looking at the file changes for JavaScript, kind of what SRI does. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that JavaScript, especially the third-party stuff, changes a lot, like a lot. You don't control the vendor's release cycle, meaning that if you have Google Analytics embedded in your payment pages, you can't determine when they release a new piece of software or a new version of Google Analytics, and that would break SRI. Or in the case where you're simply doing like a file differential, meaning that you have a tool that will show you the old version of the file and the new version, JavaScript often changes at the time of request. So what I mean by that is literally when the web browser asks for it, the server will change the file. Maybe it'll embed a user token. Maybe it'll do something called cache busting, which is adding some junk to the file to make sure the browser loads a recent copy. The point is that you cannot actually hash or verify something that is changing all the time. And also, if you just had a light, for instance, if I had a red light in here that lit up every time a file changed, you would only ever see that light lit, right? It wouldn't be particularly useful. It would be a noise thing, not a useful piece of information. So if I hop over here, I'm going to just show you guys a script detail page to explain what's going on. When we talk about integrity verification, we can look at Matomo as an example. So this is Matomo. It is a marketing tool. It is used on the Source Defense website. That's where this information is coming from. And I'm imagining right now that I am a compliance person, someone responsible for the compliance of our website. So I can hop in here. Maybe I was brought here by that list of unjustified scripts requiring justification. I can get some basic information about Matomo, like literally just biographical information. And for folks this first year doing this, there may be a lot of straight up discovery at this part. Like, hey, we've got a tool called Matomo. What does it do? Quick links to different documents and policies. So if you're doing research on who is this vendor and how secure are they, you can get that done right away. And then following immediately onto that, you can see here the justification widget. Not frankly too very much to the justification business process. It's a matter of filling out a narrative description, but we do give you a tool to do that very easily with that context that you need, and then be able to retrieve it and audit it in the future for any assessments or et cetera. The other things we do, and so we've talked about inventorying in brief, and what you can see here a little snippet of some of our inventorying techniques. Things like showing you that supply chain I've mentioned a few times so that you can understand where the code's coming from and what the relationship is between your different vendors, like that this piece of technology, Matomo, was loaded by a tag manager. So then I can ask the question, who controls that tag manager, which is an easy way to add JavaScript to a website, by the way. So who controls that tool and why are they adding these things? We also provide very useful, in my opinion, events. So we have an event-based model, meaning that when something of interest happens in the system, we will create a notification for that, for instance, a data exposure or a particular kind of data being exposed, like PII data or card data, and make administrators aware of it. So that's the first half of how we verify integrity. And I, of course, can drill into more detail here, see exactly what the script is accessing, tell the system that I'm okay with certain kinds of signals. So baselining, so I don't get anything but the most essential alerts, and et cetera. And the second thing that we do is we can actually control code as it executes. That's what we call source defense protect. Source defense protect is, like I said a few minutes ago, a way of proactively securing what a script is or is not allowed to do when it's running in your visitor's web browser. So for instance, you can see here, this is the LinkedIn marketing text, something called LinkedIn Insight. Source defense protect is running on the website from the data that we're looking at here. And we're setting rules up front for what LinkedIn Insight can and cannot do. So basically, if you were to look at LinkedIn, it doesn't really matter, but they need to set a cookie and they need to send a beacon back to LinkedIn and then do like one other thing. They have no reason to have that unfettered access, which we discussed at the top. And so Source Defense Protect locks it down, locks LinkedIn Insight down to the least necessary set of permissions for that script to do its job, and does not allow the script to exceed those permissions. So basically setting it to the most strict policy, the most strict set of rules that are applicable for it, as you can see indicated here. We're not going to read that to each other, but it's okay. Basically, we're saying that it's secure and that it's the most appropriate way to secure it so that it still performs its business function, right? That's super important. This is about, it's basically behavioral filtering. So letting the script do the things it needs to do to provide benefit to the website and not letting it see those permissions, and doing that up front so that if the script one day does change, the file changes, but it doesn't change the way the script works, great. It's still going to work. The policy is still going to be applied. The rules are still going to be followed. If the script does change and starts doing something like trying to access card data, for instance, well, we'll certainly notify the administrator of this system to that. We'll let them know something kind of spooky is happening. But Source Defense Protect would have been enforcing these rules already. So basically, we're going to prevent that malicious or at least unexpected behavior from affecting the visitor data. And that's kind of the second half of how we do integrity verification, is the idea that data is controlled before it's exposed to these outside vendors, and therefore it can't be of significant damage should someone try to steal it. Source Defense provides those rules, what we call policies, to our customers. So there's really no configuration for our customers to do as a result. Basically, when a script gets added to the website, we notice that and we fire off what we call a policy recommendation for that particular script that got added. For instance, the idea here is that someone added Matomo to our website. Source Defense has a policy about how that can run most securely. My job as an administrator of my website would be to accept this policy recommendation or change it if I see fit, block the script outright, et cetera, et cetera. You could also actually have the system automatically accept policies if you wanted to, in which case it's fully automated. So you wouldn't have to do anything at all. So that's why our customers find this to be so lightweight in terms of total cost of ownership. There's very, very little for a person to do in this dashboard, whether they're security or they're compliance or they're a subject matter expert or not. There's very little actual work to do here because the system's taking care of it for you. And in the cases where you're using Source Defense Protect, you are actually in a position where the system is going to take care of a lot of the actual security work for you. So less than 5 hours per month is usually what we see in terms of usage of these dashboards and our tools. So I know it was maybe more of a demo than I had intended, but I've been talking about this stuff for a very long time, and I could go on all day if we really wanted to, but we don't. As promised, the goal of today was to talk about how to solve this problem. So what I hope to bring to bear here in terms of project planning sense, how to solve it in that way as we stare down March of 2025 and the coming holiday season and everything else that is constraining these particular projects. And what I hope to do here is bring to bear some of my professional experience, some of what we've heard, or a lot of what we've heard from customers and organizations who are implementing this stuff and how they're actually getting it done, and some common pitfalls and how long that might take. If we take a look here, I've built out a little bit of a timeline. So I'd say that basically there's 4 parts to this. And, I mean, I'm sure everyone on the phone has done project planning or has thought about things like this or gone through, getting stuff onboarded. So this is my view of this. I'm sure you all have your own perspectives on it. But basically, I break it down into discovery, evaluation, acquisition, and completion for the project. Discovery, I would put into that bucket the questions that come to mind when one is thinking about these problems. So basically, what do we have in terms of if you have a solution for this in-house? You honestly probably don't, but more so also like, what are the constraints internally for this project? Do we have the resources we need? Do we have the right stakeholders on board? The discovery stuff. Also the environment. So thinking about what payment pages you have, where they're located, and et cetera. Doing an environment scan, so to speak, of what's available on the market. What tools are out there, what is commonly done, what your peers are doing, perhaps, and what you need to do to make a decision. And then basically, what's your plan? Sometimes folks, obviously, it's pretty brass tacks project management stuff, but work backwards from a date. If again, March 2025 is certainly looming large, but that doesn't mean anybody's going to be able to implement a solution the 3rd week of February to be ready for that. So working backwards from that, and then also factoring in, rolling in there, depending on your area of practice. Do you have a code freeze coming up? Do you guys lock down the website or the equivalent for the holiday season or another particularly revenue sensitive season? Dev cycles, frankly, that kind of thing. So can you get into the sprints that the devs are using to integrate code? Evaluation, identify the right teams, analyze the results that you get, and then agree on the results of that. If not a commercial decision or something else, then at least an idea that we're all going in the same direction. This is the plan that we're going to go with. I think that this part in evaluation and discovery, something I've noticed along the way, is that it can be very, very useful at this step to consider all the stakeholders. So this is an area that touches a bunch of different disciplines. I mentioned this at the top, but you've got digital commerce, e-commerce, marketing, however your organization defines it, application development, AppSec or security, GRC. There's a lot of players in this particular play. And so you want to make sure that all those are on board. That's just more of a personal aside than anything else, is that a lot of people involved in these kind of things. As we look forward to acquisition, so actually bringing the thing on board, procurement, scheduling, and operations. Like I said, I think it's important to consider those different parties in this. And now we're talking about 31 to 60 days out. So assuming that we've been through about a month now, and that we're ready to actually sew some stuff up and be on board. And then finally, completion of the project. So getting things done, deployed, trained, and verified, meaning that, and for verification here, I mean that, of course, we should have success criteria for our projects, but that we should make sure we're meeting the requirements at the end, that those boxes do get checked. There is a practical part of this. Of course, our websites will be more secure at the end of it, but it's also important that we make sure that the solution actually got us to a state of compliance at the end of it, and that you're all sewn up in time for March. And so if we start to look at that, if we're 3 months out, we're already in April, almost May now, right? You're getting right into August. You're going to go all the way through this. And that's the beginning of it. If folks on the phone are commerce, that's the beginning of the holiday season, more or less. So I'm just saying that there is a snowball effect here. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but there's always less time on the calendar than we think. And so that's how I see these things usually run. If we look at how source defense can contribute to that, and again, this is somewhat self-congratulatory, but I do help run our evaluation processes and a lot of other stuff. But we can get our evaluations done, meaning another word for that would be proof of concept or testing or et cetera. I can get those done for you in as little as a week. Testing environments are a snap for us to set up on your payment pages, scan them externally, deploy code, whatever you want to do. I can get you results out of that in a week to prove, or at least offer evidence that source defense meets the goals that you're looking to do and satisfies the requirements. It's not an arduous process for your teams to get done. Something I've really tried to stress here in my own work is making sure that what we're giving to our customers, whether they're prospective or current, are materials that really help them in terms of business. Like, I want to give you the stuff you need to actually get the project done and not have to become experts on every single vendor technology and every single widget of it. We want to give you a thing that really supports your process. So materials, artifacts, documents, whatever else, in a way that's digestible by other humans at your organization and that you don't have to put together yourself, and then deploy and deliver in days. So like I said before, we can and have deployed in as little as 24 hours. And that's an integrated code deployment live on a website from initial conversation to done and dusted. Well, shout out to our professional services team. They do an excellent job. But basically, if you want to solve this and not spend, the next 6 months in code review and deliberation and every other thing, we can do that. It goes very, very well. And also, just as an aside, in terms of dev time and how much this what you're asking for of your developers with source defense, I mean, maybe I'll go back to this slide. It's copying and pasting this code on the right-hand side of my screen. That's the whole thing. It's about an hour of work, if that, for a web developer. So what we're trying to get at there is that you can solve this very, very easily. And we would love to support you as you figure out how you're going to solve it. That's the goal for us. So to reiterate and to mention a couple of other things, source defense, we have bespoke technology purpose-built to solve this problem. In fact, we helped inform and draft some of the requirements, 643 and 1161, amongst many, many others. But point being is our tech has been here before these requirements. We satisfy them, and we'll be here tomorrow to do other cool stuff. Secondly, that we are ready to help you now. So our teams are ready and raring to go. I do expect there to be a crunch for everybody at the end of the year. If you think about it, every single person with a payment page on Earth is going to be trying to do something about this in the next year. So, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but things are only going to get more hectic for everybody, including the vendors, in this coming few months. So something to consider, and that we can get it done very, very easily for you without stress on your teams, without stress on you if you're the person who's managing a project, but it's not like, going to implement the code. You're just trying to get this GRC stuff squared away and move on to the next requirement. We would like to help you without having, we'd like to help you have to do as little project management as possible, put it away. If you'd like to get started, we do offer instances of that dashboard. You can get a copy of that dashboard we saw before for your own website at no cost. We give you access to it for 90 days so you can see it and understand what we can do for you. And really, you could theoretically then just use that as a point of departure for the rest of your project, or you could think about coming on board with us and seeing what we could do overall. You can hit up sourcedefense.com/free-PCI and fill out a form there, and you would get access to your own custom dashboard and see what the client-side security landscape is like for your actual web property. And really the goal there for me is to help you kind of supercharge that project. If you're in that discovery phase, which a lot of folks are right now, hopefully this should give you a toehold into the overall process, understanding your web pages better, understanding the security, and understanding what you would need to do, both to get up to speed and in compliance for March 2025, and to continue to do this thing for the foreseeable future and whatever comes next. So I'm going to pause there, and we'll see what questions have come in. I'm happy to answer them, as well as criticism of any kind, although generally I like it to be positive, relatively fragile ego. So, be kind. All right, I've got a question here. It says, can you explain what parts of 6.4.2 overlap with this? Is any of that applicable for the discussion of client-side security? It's an interesting question. The short answer is that they're two somewhat distinct areas of practice. As I understand 6.4.2, it's basically exclusively about web application firewalls. So there's another aspect of web application security, of course, where traffic coming into our web servers needs to be secured or handled in a secure fashion. If you've got a bad actor out on the internet and they try to stuff a bunch of data into the web pages to try to affect an SQL injection or something else, that would be the kind of task that a web application firewall would be helpful in securing. However, a WAF does not do anything for pushing content out into a web browser. The code's executing out in a web browser in the world. To be very technical about it, basically you're talking about the second half of the HTTP conversation. So what I mean by that is the server pushes out the web page into the web browser, and then the code runs there. The WAF has no purview or control over the client-side part of things. So they're two different distinct areas of practice, despite being so close together, 642 and 643. So we do need controls that are different for each. All right, it appears that we do not have any more questions. You're going to receive a couple links right after this, including to those white papers, to a copy of that action plan that I mentioned, so you can reference it on your own and have an outline, a roadmap for your own investigations into this and solution for 643 and 1161. If you'd like to see your own stuff in our dashboards, very, very, very soon, with very little delay, sourcedefense.com/free PCI. And if you have any questions for me in specific, again, my name's Matt McGurk. My email address is matthew@sourcedefense.com. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about any part of this at any length, believe it or not. So once again, thank you everyone for your time and attention. I hope you have an excellent rest of your day, and I wish you the best of luck on solving these problems and anything else on your plate.